Welcome to History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author and journalist Valerie Bauerlein, The Devil at His Elbow. If you somehow missed this case of Alex Murdaugh, you might have heard it, not heard the name. His wife and son were brutally murdered, and then a couple days later, he's nearly assassinated while trying to fix a flat tire on his car. All over the place. But if you missed it, don't worry. We're going to give you background. There's already been so many documentaries and so many books out on Murdaugh, and I've read or seen most of them, but Valerie, who we're talking to today, was a journalist on the ground. This, to me, is the place you go if you want the full story. It's told masterfully. It has everything in there. Even after seeing and reading other things before this, I still learned a lot from Valerie's book. I loved it. Loved talking to her. That's why I'm going to shut up, and we can hear from Valerie. And here we are with author Valerie Bauerlein, The Devil at His Elbow, Alex Murdaugh, and the Fall of a Southern Dynasty. Valerie, so excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Valerie, this is your first book, but you're a Wall Street Journal reporter who is, by the way, still putting stuff out. I checked. How do you do both at the same time? Do you have to just tell work, hey, a few days I'm going to be working on the book, I'm going to be doing this, or do you just have to do everything at once?
You do everything at once, really, and you try to have a life along the way. I'm really thrilled to say that, I wrote the story for the journal. It was the journal story that kind of gave rise to the book. And once I pitched the book as a separate project, I had to leave. So I was able to take more than a year away from my day job to research the book. I was in court every day. So I took a nice long break to research and write the book. And so now I'm back at the day job trying to do both things with varying degrees of success.
Because you've covered a lot of stories. I know Katrina was one of them in there. What made you say, this is the first book? Was it just timing, or did you sit there and say, this is something that I can turn into an actual book?
It's funny. I grew up in the South. I've lived in North or South Carolina almost my entire life. And I've covered the South all that time. And I worked in South Carolina, but covered South Carolina politics for a long time. So it's sort of the spiritual part of my work. I'm a national affairs reporter, but I live in North Carolina. I cover South Carolina, and I have a lot of friends there. So I was at this case when it happened. I was familiar with the family. I was familiar with the place, but more than that, I was familiar with the way that the power works there. And so it was always interesting to me as a story. And once you started getting into it, I was like, wow, this is potentially a vehicle to make a lot of observations about the way power works that I've wanted to make my whole career.
Now, you mentioned you kind of already knew the name before this popped up. What was generally known about the Murdaugh family before this all almost literally blew up?
I think in South Carolina, at least, the boat wreck involving Mallory Beach back in February of 2019 was a really big story. I mean, it was the death of a beautiful young 19-year-old girl in a horrendous circumstance and some confusion about who was driving. And it was a drunken wreck, we knew, but who was ever going to be charged? Why was there a delay? So that was on my radar for a while, starting in 2019. But I was also familiar with the family just in the sense that I knew that they were big in that part of the world. I had not interacted with them. The Murdaugh family traditionally kept their world to the 14th Circuit, the 5 counties that are in the Low Country. But I knew somewhat of them, just as a family that was influential.
Was there whispers before even the Mallory Beach incident that they maybe had everything kind of locked down, that maybe anything that happens within their territory might get taken care of, not perfectly legally?
That wasn't on my radar so much. I think certainly my reporting showed that for a century in the 14th Circuit in the Low Country, those 5 counties in the southeastern corner, yes, for certain that they had a huge amount of power. I think what was clear to me as having lived in South Carolina for a while and covered the legislature, the governor's office, how power works there, that there is a phenomenon of rural barons. It's just the case that in a lot of these rural counties, one family ran it for a long time. And so it was very familiar to me. Oh, okay. So one family up is X family, one family over is Y family, but in this part of the world, it's the Murdaughs. So that part felt very, very, very familiar.
So now everyone got introduced to, what did I want to call him? A piece of trash, Alex Murdaugh, when his wife and son are killed, and then all of a sudden he's almost killed. And if for anyone listening, if you've never heard of the story, I don't know how big the rock you were able to live under was, but it was sizable. The Murdaugh family goes way back, though. Like this is almost pretty much the end of this, as you call it with the book title, dynasty. How far back does the Murdaugh family go in this timeline?
The Murdaugh family in this part of the world in Islandton, which is where Moselle is, they go back to the Revolutionary War. They really do. I mean, there's a Murdaugh family cemetery that we passed as I traveled with the jury out to Moselle. You passed the family cemetery going back to the 18th century. But in terms of the current Murdaugh family, the way we think about the power and the way they ran these communities goes back to around 1920. So 100 years. And that's the year that Randolph Sr., Alex's great-great-grandfather, ran for solicitor and won. And then the family held that office for the better part of 100 years. So 1920, but, really before that.
I'm going to be real careful because this family does have a tendency to keep reusing names. It makes it,
yes,
especially for a reporter. I'm sure you were sitting there going, how do I differentiate all these Busters and Randolph? It's got to be a challenge.
It is very difficult because there is a tendency in the South and in this family to use the same names, family names, middle names as first names, all that sort of stuff.
And especially with a family of, well, I'll just say villains. There's no other way to do it. With the kind of family of villains, I think it almost seems like out of a bad movie. That, something like... no, My Cousin Vinny is a fantastic movie. Let's not use that one. But there are movies, especially bad action movies, where you're in the South and the sheriff knows everybody and you're going to get railroaded. These movies really try and kind of denigrate the South in a lot of different ways. But unfortunately, in this particular instance, it's a bit closer to reality than anybody would want to admit, right?
I think it's really pretty complicated. The Murdaughs were one of the founding families of this county. I think one of the things I found most interesting about Hampton County was it actually wasn't formed until after Reconstruction. So the area where Hampton County, that is currently Hampton County, General Sherman marched through in two flanks, 65,000 troops. And it's stunning to think about a small community of, 20,000 people then, 20,000 people now, 65,000 troops march through and burn everything in sight, right? And so I found this often in trying to go back and find records. The librarians would look at you and say it so quaintly, well, this is a burned county. Those records don't exist before 1865. So what was stunning to me about this part of the world is that after Reconstruction fell, there was a move to found a white county, to secede from what they called the Black Republic of Beaufort, which still had a predominantly Black Republican government, and for the white families that had been Confederate leaders to form their own government. And the new governor, who was Wade Hampton, one of the largest slave owners of the South, Confederate general, he said yes. He allowed them to start this county, and also was honored that they wanted to name it after him. He actually rode down on horseback and laid the cornerstone of the Hampton County Courthouse, where the Murdaughs went on to practice law for 100 years. So I think what was stunning to me about Hampton County is that it started from a specific point of view to reestablish white leadership the way that it had been before 1861. And the Murdaughs were related to the Varns, Barnville is one of the main towns there, and they moved there in the 1880s and set up their family life there and became one of the founding families to this day of this community that was founded for this very specific reason. So I think that was one of the things that it was important to me in the book, is to say this is not a place that happened accidentally. It came to be for a specific reason.
Yes, I'm sure there's wonderful people in Hampton County, but that is not a great start to a county.
I was thinking about your question about villainy, because I think that the family... There is a lot of evidence that early on, Randolph Murdaugh Sr., who started the law firm in 1910 and became solicitor in 1920, there is a lot of evidence that the family did have impulse in the public interest, right? To be solicitor, to be prosecutor, to call balls and strikes. But fairly early on, there's signs that they were also very willing to cut corners. I think it's fair to characterize Alex Murdaugh as a villain. I think that's fair. But I think the family started in a more nuanced fashion.
I mean, when you get down to his son, Paul, you can't just look and say, well, Paul was a bad kid. You do have to look back. There's a huge history to this. And as you talked about, where the family kind of starts cutting corners, but they want to be lawyers. And then it's just generations of, well, somebody's got to be a lawyer. Somebody's got to keep this going. It starts to feel like they're kind of family original sins that are passed down through every generation. And I think you write significantly about that, because you can't just jump right to Alex. You have to start from the beginning and kind of say that maybe this tree was a little bit rotten from the beginning.
I started working on the book in October of 21. And as you'll remember, Alec wasn't charged until July of 22 with homicides. He wasn't really significantly charged with any of the thefts, including Gloria Satterfield, when I signed the contract to write this book. So I spent a significant amount of time trying to understand this place, this family, their history. And one of the first things I looked at, to your point, was dynasties. What do we know about dynasties in the Bible, in England, and Shakespeare, in our country, the Ford family, but especially in China, right? And if you look at China, there's a lot of history of Chinese dynasties, and almost always they break down on the fourth or fifth generation. Sometimes it could be outside forces, famine, warfare, but often it's internal, it's generational rot. It is the entitlement that can grow when your business is to perpetuate the family business, and entitlement is part of the deal. So I think that by the time, Paul and Buster Murdaugh were the fifth generation. And I think that the patterns were very well established by the time Paul in particular came around.
Now, we could probably do an entire podcast just on the ancestors as opposed to descendants. When with Alex's case, and I should clarify this too, we're saying his name a bit differently, because even when he introduced himself, it sounded like what it was, Alex Murdaugh or something like that.
Well, and I think we were familiar with the phenomenon of code switching. My college roommate used to tease me. I'd get on the phone with my grandmother and my accent would just my Southern accent would get really strong. And I think Alec, you can hear it. He pronounces his name one way on the 911 tape. He pronounces his name another way with the insurance adjuster in the Gloria Satterfield case. He pronounces his name yet another way on the stand. So he does. It's an issue. I think there were some TikToks that my kids found that were critical of the way I pronounce his name. And I was like, dude, he's not consistent with it either. But one of the things that's consistent is typically he says Alex Murdaugh. I'm
just going to keep calling him Alex Murdaugh because he doesn't deserve for me to care.
But he's a lawyer. I mean, Dick Harpootlian calls him Alex Murdaugh. And then if you go to Hampton, I spent a considerable amount of time in Hampton. They call the family the Murdaugh family, Alex Murdaugh. And so there are a number of ways that is pronounced.
So anyway, if you're listening, we're talking about the same guy, I promise, no matter what.
We're talking about the same guy.
Now, Liz, you're a seasoned reporter. I want to know, at what point did you sit there and say, this case is going to be something? Because, I mean, this exploded. Everyone was talking about it. It wasn't just something in the South that people were talking about. At what point did you sit there and say, this is going to be one of those quote unquote trials of the century that they love to throw around?
Gosh, I made my first trip down in July of 21. So I was interested in the case pretty soon from the beginning, but it's not on its face a Wall Street Journal story. And I'm a Wall Street Journal reporter. There was some this is a true crime story, Val. Why would you be interested in it? I was like, it actually is a classic Wall Street Journal story. It's about money and power, and it's set in an interesting place. It elucidates something about this country that we live in. So it is a Wall Street Journal story. It took a little bit of convincing internally, I would say, to make that point. So I was working on the story over the course of the summer of 21, and then the news business, I'm a national affairs reporter. News is constant. So that same summer was the tragic collapse of the condos in Surfside in Florida. So I spent a considerable amount of time down there working on those stories and just kind of pulling the thread at the Murdaugh story. And I was wondering, when am I going to have a chance to really devote all my time to getting this story done, telling our readers why this is interesting. And then Labor Day happened. And Labor Day is when, it's never make news on a slow news weekend. And Alex Murdaugh on that Saturday of the Labor Day weekend in 2021 said that he was the victim of a drive-by shooting, and the story jumped to a whole other level of crazy. So that was when I knew something is very strange here. And then also, he was already on the cover of People magazine when that happened. There was something that had captured the national imagination before that shooting, and then it just catapulted. So that was around the time where I said, gosh, I got to get the story in the newspaper, because people want to know what is going on in Hampton, South Carolina.
Something that I noticed about the reporting is when his wife and son are murdered. And like you said, that was caught up. People started talking about that. But as I read multiple articles, because it just sounded like, this is crazy. But the first few articles, especially after the murder of Maggie and Paul, were kind of, hey, reporters, like, here is what we know. When Alex reported that he was part of a drive-by shooting, it's one of the few times where I could see every single reporter is kind of like, hey, I'm going to tell you what they're telling us, but I already smell something bad going on. It's very few times that reporters kind of step back and say, listen, we know that there's way more coming out about this and we don't believe it either, but we can't say it just yet. Was that just me in my head, or did you kind of notice that too, that once that drive-by shooting, and I'm doing air quotes, people, did that kind of change things?
Earlier in my career, I was a night cops reporter. I covered the police beat for 3 years, and I had a situation where there was a sheriff's deputy who said he was shot by several people who had attacked him in a traffic stop. And it launched this manhunt. He said he was white. He said the men were Hispanic men. And so it was very racially tinged in the region. It was a big story. And then it all unwound because he made it up. He was a deputy whose girlfriend was a 911 dispatcher, and he called in his own shooting. And so from the beginning, I was remembering that experience, that multiple day experience of being told something that was sort of implausible and finding out later. So I think that experience was in my mind. But specific to the Alex Murdaugh situation, this was 3 months after Maggie and Paul died, right? July, August, September. So by that point, you had Reddit, subreddit, and all of these folks online who were incredible sleuths, amateur sleuths, but incredible sleuths, who had spent weeks and months questioning what Alex Murdaugh was saying. And pretty soon, in addition to the subredditors, there were a lot, podcasts and local news who were raising really significant questions early on. So I think by that point, the snowball was starting to roll downhill, where there was significant skepticism from the beginning with him. He got the benefit of the doubt after June 7th, but once you get to September 4th, 2021, he did not get the benefit of the doubt very long.
Now, I don't want to get too far into it because I do want people to read the book, but when we're talking about suspicious deaths, right, where does it start with Alex? And let's say Alex and his sons. Where does the first death start that everyone's starting to say, hey, wait a second, we got to go back and look at this?
I think particular to this generation, I think over the years, and this, I write about this in the book, there are suspicious deaths and questionable deaths and potential involvement in untimely deaths over the course of years with the family. But specific to this generation of Alex and Paul and Buster, in 2015, Stephen Smith, who was a classmate of Buster Murdaugh, the older of the two sons, was found dead in the middle of a road in Hampton County. And that was really the first death where people questioned the Murdaugh name in any potential involvement. And I should say, to this day, there's no substantial proof that any Murdaugh had anything to do with the death of Stephen Smith at all. But from the beginning, their name was mentioned in that case.
Now, I will ask, I want to put a point on this because I've seen enough other places where this is reported. A lot of places, at least two, say that Buster and Stephen Smith were involved, let's say physically. You're saying that you couldn't find anything like that, because I find it interesting. Other sources have not necessarily said that did happen, but they hint very heavily at it so that they are really drawing that line. For you, you don't seem to do that in this book. Is it just not quite there for you, or is it just all whispers and you can't show it?
It's an excellent question. I think one of my goals in this book was to be very specific about what we know. And that's part of the Wall Street Journal training, but that's also just really important to me as a reporter. What exactly do we know and can we say and back up? And there is no credible evidence. There is no evidence at all that I found or that I've seen, and I've looked, that there was any sort of physical relationship with Stephen Smith and any member of the Murdaugh family. There is his mom, Sandy Smith, has talked about his. He was gay. He was out. He was on Craigslist. He was doing some sex work. I mean, I think that is something the family has openly acknowledged. But there's no evidence that he had a relationship with Buster. And somewhat belatedly, because there have been a lot of rumors to this point. I mean, somewhat belatedly, right after in March of 23, Buster Murdaugh came out and put a statement and said, I had no relationship with him. Please stop saying I did. It's unfair and it's untrue. Certainly was the local rumor, certainly was repeated in a lot of news reports or alluded to, but I found no evidence for that to be the case. I tried very hard to avoid saying that it was because I just, I didn't find it.
I mean, it's fine. I can speculate all I want. No one can do it. I'm not a reporter. Doesn't matter. But it's really important to talk about Stephen Smith.
I mean, it is important to note that in this exhaustive, South Carolina Highway Patrol report that they did, the name comes up dozens of times. The Murdaugh name comes up dozens of times. And I spent more than 4 months on the ground, a lot of it in Hampton County. And there certainly are rumors to that effect, but I just didn't find any evidence to back up that solidly.
I mean, even without that connection, it's so important that Stephen Smith, that Gloria Satterfield, that Mallory Beach, that their names and their families get to talk. That's
yes.
A lot of what you have in your book is missing in a lot of other places because I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, a lot of this stuff is getting rushed. They wanted to get everything out there. And very often what happens with bad true crime is it's all about the perpetrator. It's all about the villain. And these real people are just victims, face, here's your name, and then let's put in salacious details and move on. How important was it for you to not do that?
I'm so glad you read the book and spent, paid such attention to it. It was important to me to really let these families introduce themselves, talk about themselves, what this experience had been like. From the beginning, I was never going to be the first book out. It was going to take me a long time. And so now we are 3 years and change after the homicides. But I wanted to take the time to get it right. And then also to have the time to interview as many people as I could. I think that from the beginning, it was one of the questions that people asked, a common question is, Alex Murdaugh is such a villainous, hard person to understand. There's something deeply twisted in his psyche. He is a main character of this book. Who is the reader going to pull for? Why pick up a book about a deeply bad person if there's not someone to make you understand the stakes? And I saw the opportunity to spend time with the Pickneys and the Beaches and other families to really explain the impact that his evil meant to their lives.
And we're just talking about people that actually died. There's plenty of people that Alex just straight ripped off. That's another just huge part of the book is just this list of this happened to this person, Alex took their money. This person, Alex took their money because everyone trusted him, right?
Well, and it had for many, many years. And I think one of the things that stunned me, I ran across an affidavit from Alex's father, Randolph Murdaugh III. It was a stunning affidavit. Can you imagine if you're the prosecutor and you say, I know every eligible juror by name in this county, every single one. And not just his own county, but multiple counties within his circuit. It's just a stunning thing to think you would know every single person. And Alec was the beneficiary of that level of knowledge. And there is a lot of evidence. I found a ton of evidence you could call it favor trading. You could say, I heard that your daughter was an offender bender. Let me call the insurer and make it go away. And then coincidentally, that 16-year-old's dad would be on a jury 3 weeks later, and they would have some sympathy for the argument that the Murdaughs were making, either in criminal or civil court. There is no doubt that over the course of 100 years, jurors knew the Murdaughs knew them, and there was a huge amount of influence and goodwill or fear or whatever that impacted the way people made decisions on the jury. And it also impacted people's trust of Alec. He stole money not because nobody was looking at this, nobody would dare question him.
What's the estimate, to the best of your knowledge, of how much money he stole total?
The state and the feds do not agree on the total amount that Alex stole from his clients, but the feds are saying roughly $10 million. And I think that we may never know, because the firm has also said there were some cases that predated charges. So we don't really know, but the best estimate I found, and the one I rely on, is from the federal government, and it's roughly $10 million.
Feels pretty low. When you read all of it, it feels low.
Well, it feels, yes, I can see that. We're conservative. We're trying to go with what we can prove.
When I look back on the book, there was a lot of things I liked on first read, but the more I've thought about it, what I think you do, that definitely I'm not seeing anywhere else, is you seem to actually get into Alex's psyche. You don't diagnose him or anything like that, so I don't want to put words in your mouth there. But the dude is a straight sociopath, and I love that you show don't tell. It's just, here's what he said. Here's what he's saying from prison. Here are the things that he's doing. Once you dig into him, there's just a litany of evidence that this guy does not care about anybody but himself. And yes, murdering his wife and son should have been the biggest part of that. But there's just nothing in this man that seems to have any regret, any guilt. He seems almost incapable of having any of it.
Readers are really smart. And I think the best thing sometimes that we can do is just show what we know. Here's what we know. Here's what I know. Here's what I saw. I sat in the courtroom for 6 weeks. There was certainly a period of time where I was hopeful that he would talk to me. Who wouldn't want to go interview a subject of great fascination, a subject of great national interest? I certainly would. I wanted to write the definitive book about this case. I wanted to talk to the person at the center of it very badly. But he took the stand of his own volition and spoke for 2 days. He told us everything that was on his mind. He had the chance to tell us everything that was on his mind. And then even after that, he was sentenced later, after the criminal trial, when he testified for 2 days, he was sentenced in Beaufort on the financials and spoke for another hour. He spoke again in Charleston on the federal financials. And it was sitting there. At one point, I just put my pen down and stared at him, because he was talking about the media. And it was so amazing to me that he was revealing himself to everyone in the room but himself. He was, and Judge Newman said as much. He said, I don't think you know who you are. I think you're, a mystery even to yourself. I think you're empty. And I hope that by using his own words, the reader gets a chance to come to that same understanding that I did.
Yeah, that he's a total and irredeemable scumbag.
Yeah, he's a husk. I think he's an empty, and part of me, the search for a title was a challenge, because you wanted to come up with something new to say. But I certainly looked at T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, because I think there is something hollow at his core that is hard for us to understand. The lack of human compassion is very hard for other humans to understand.
I mean, the litany of things that you have in this book, we do not have time to go over all of them. He will rip off anyone at any time. And then the thought and planning he had to go into murdering his own wife and child is amazing. Right? But crimes of passion, you can kind of talk yourself into and say somebody just went crazy for a minute and then they felt bad about it. This is a guy who could just cold-bloodedly do some of the worst things you've ever heard of, and then has the gall to get on the stand. And if you get on the stand as a defendant, you are effectively saying, I think I can talk this away. I think if people just hear me, they're not going to think I did this. And as you said, he did at least twice for hours. It's amazing to me.
Well, I think I try to show this in the book, but speaking in that courtroom in particular was the Murdaugh's birthright. He was in a courtroom in Colleton County where his family had been talking to jurors for more than 100 years. Alec himself had tried one of the only cases he ever tried in that room. And one of the witnesses that he used as a prosecutor was the guy that took the GSR test on his hands that night at Moselle. There's so many echoes. It was his birthright in a lot of respects to speak in that room. I mean, there was a lot made of the fact that his grandfather's portrait had to be taken off the back wall because his grandfather was, Buster Murdaugh Jr. had been revered greatly in that part of the world. So, yeah, I don't know. I think he wanted to take the stand. He did take the stand, and he told all of us who he was.
The death of Mallory Beach, Paul's driving the boat while absolutely hammered, which apparently he was all the time, and it ends up killing Mallory Beach. Was that the beginning of the end of this dynasty? Do you think that if that doesn't happen that night, all of this continues to go and he gets away with everything? Or do you think this was going to happen with this generation of Murdaughs no matter what went on?
It's an excellent question. I think, a couple points. So there's a second case that I don't get into in the book. I did do a front page story for the Journal about Greg Parker, the Parker's convenience store where Paul bought the beer and everything the night of the murder. So the family is also suing the convenience store of a number of years. And one of the consultants in that case had a famous line that came out in Discovery and Email. And he said, "Don't forget, this involves the death of a beautiful blonde girl, a girl who was completely innocent and very sympathetic." So I do think the fact that Mallory was universally adored, and it brought a lot of attention to the wreck and to the family that was unwelcome. But I think the second part of that is that they hired Mark Tinsley, who Judge Newman called him a tiger on his tail. Mark Tinsley is a relentless personal injury lawyer, one county over from the Murdaughs. So close to the Murdaughs, I put this in the book, he had a security key to get into the law firm. He was very trusted. He was part of the group. And he knew once he took the Beach family's case, he knew the kinds of things that Alec was capable of to avoid responsibility. And he decided that he wasn't going to let him get away with it. So I think it was two things. I think it was Mallory Beach. I think it was Mark Tinsley. But to your other point, I also think that Paul had shown no signs since the wreck of changing. And I think that was also, there was some inevitability to what Paul was doing in the wake of the boat wreck. That was tough.
I mean, talking to all these victim families, how hard is it for you as a reporter, as an author? Mallory specifically usually comes up the most, but you're talking to a lot of people whose lives were destroyed, and you hope that they have a little bit of solace because of what's happening to Alex now and that he never sees the light of day. But having those conversations, I think anybody reading a book like this will say, you just have all of these kind of skill sets that you've built up as a reporter so that you know what to ask, what to stay away from. It's still going to be brutal that you have to see these people, talk to them, and then you have to somehow divorce yourself enough to stay objective and then put it into a book. Is that hard for you? Is it second nature at this point? What's it like?
I think it is true. I've been doing this 29 years, and it's the reason I'm still doing it. It's such a privilege when people, especially people who have been through unspeakable things, trust you and sit down with you and tell you their story. I mean, it really is the reason to keep doing this work, to be the conduit, hopefully. So no, it was a huge part of the work is to sit down with these families. And I do think that some of the families found, comfort's the wrong word, solace is the wrong word. But Philip Beach, in particular, Mallory's dad, said he felt like some measure of justice had been done with Alex being held accountable for all the things his family had done over the years.
So, Valerie, we need to bring this up. I have to. You got me. You got me good. You've seen my review. As I've already mentioned, I've seen and read a lot of stuff on this from beginning to end from different directions. And one of the things that I say in the review is, as I'm going through, I'm like, Valerie's pretty detailed here. Well, probably could have skipped this page. Maybe
parts of it. What parts of it were you going, this is more than I need?
The badge in the hospital. I'm not going to say how it comes back because I want every reader to go into that. But you harp on Alex at the hospital having his badge out. And I'm just kind of like, she keeps bringing it up. But I just remember the case. It's not part of the case. And then you get to the court case. And the questions are coming, and then you turn on the light bulb for me. And I remember I put my Kindle down and I went, she got me. She got me. I didn't see it coming. It was a rope-a-dope. She nailed me. Were you just trying to really John Grisham this whole thing? Were you trying to just say, no, I'm the queen now of courtroom drama? Is that what you were going for?
I did read your review and it was very humbling. I appreciated it. I read it more than once. We're not supposed to read the reviews, but Brendan Dees, I did read multiple times. I think that what the badge gave me the opportunity to do was say, y'all, there's a through line in this family. And spoiler alert, the badges that he used were not just his own, but his grandfather's. There was a reason, there was a through line from what he was inheriting to what he was trying to do for his own son that night in the hospital. And I think that hospital scene, the night that Mallory Beach is killed and is missing, the other young people are at the hospital. He's there first with his father, who is a prosecutor. The other young people's parents aren't there yet. He was exercising an advantage. It was the most clear distillation I felt like I could give the reader of, look, I'm going to give you multiple pages of every beat of what happens that night. I hope that it helps you understand how Alec worked and how, by extension, this family worked for 100 years.
At the same time, you give the prosecutor that feeling, it's almost like Sherlock Holmes, that he had seen something that nobody else would have seen, nobody else would have put together, and he puts it under the light and says, hey, look at this now. And you have that aha moment, and very often these are in fictional courtroom cases. They're not in real life. People talk about the law being super boring and there's procedure, and there isn't those big aha moments, but this is one of those real life ones. And yeah, you pulled the wool over my eyes, and you're talking about being humbled. I was humbled, Valerie. I read all of these books.
I was sitting there, Brendan, I was like, is this happening? Because we talked a little bit earlier about who is the reader going to pull for? Who are the people that are trying to expose Alec for who he is? And I think Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor, was certainly one of those. And he was the person that saw in the security video of the hospital that night, he was the person that noticed, wait, what is that on the outside of his badge? And I think in that moment, Alec didn't know that the state knew he had his badge out. So it was an aha moment to me as a person that followed the case incredibly closely, but it also was a time for me as an author. I think our job in a lot of ways is to make meaning for the reader, to help connect the dots. And I was like, okay, here's where I can help explain how this family works.
So Valerie, normally my last question is, people think nonfiction's boring.
Can't be our last question. I'm having too much fun.
I'm sorry. We could do it again. You just read another book. We'll do it right again. But I want to change the question up, because I think this is very important for anybody who listens to this who already knows the case. They're going to say, I saw the documentary on Netflix. I saw a book on it already, or I read that. I know what the answer to this is, but I want you to have the ability to answer this. I saw stuff. I read stuff. I loved it, obviously. That's why you're here. But if somebody was sat in front of you and said, listen, I've already read everything there is to read on this case. I've already seen everything there is to see on this case. Why should I read your book? What would you say?
Well, you tell me, why should they?
Well, first of all, because it's all there. I'll just be honest, something that I'm seeing, especially with true crime lately, you've already talked about it, the rush to get it out there. I hate it. I just do. When someone puts out a book on this horrible murder where the case hasn't even gone to court yet, where there hasn't been anything, you don't know what's going to happen. You're basically trying to write an article, turn an article that is unfinished into a book. And like you said, you took the time to get it right. It's all in there. I think you find out why Alex is the way he is, why the whole family was the way they were, how the court case came together, because it's easy to sit from the outside and say, dude's guilty. What a moron. It's very different to understand how the jurors got there. And then, of course, time for, the victims' families to actually be able to talk. But now you made me answer the question. See, you got me again.
No, I legitimately was curious. But no, I think, Dick Harpootlian, the lead lawyer for Alec, said this to me multiple times. He goes, how can you write a book? The ending is unfinished. We don't know what happens. And so in some respects, it was incredible that Alec asked for a speedy trial, B, got one, and that C, the jury convicted him. There was a sense of finality. And so we will go through a number of years of appeals and all manner of appeals, but there is a sense of finality in that a jury of his peers in Colleton County, where Moselle is, found him guilty of killing Maggie and Paul, full stop. That is an ending. And so this case will go on for many more years, but there was an ending there where I felt sufficiently satisfied to be able to say, all right, here, at least this book is, this is the first chapter. I would also say, like, I've become quite close to a guy named Avery Wilkes. He wrote the Mega Thread. Did you follow this? He was a Post and Courier, Charleston Post and Courier reporter, terrific reporter. And every day he sat and wrote the Mega Thread of the trial. And every beat of testimony that was significant, every piece of evidence, he would scan the photo. And so it was this massive, 6 weeks, every day, beat by beat by beat. And he said to me, he's like, Val, I don't know how you're going to make sense of this. How are you going to tell a story out of it? And so I think that was something that I felt I could add. After all the Netflix and HBO and the podcast, I could add, let me tell you a story, A, B, C, and D. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a man. And then at the end. So hopefully there is some arc to it and some meaning from it that readers will find.
Well, Valerie, it's a fantastic book, and if there's justice in this world, Alex will die alone in prison. So that's just mine. You don't have to say that. I'm saying that.
Well, I will add, I tried to be present every minute of every important moment of his case, right? Including in April of this year, April of 2024, was his sentencing on the federal financials. So sort of almost like an afterthought. He'd been sentenced on the murders, which are huge. He'd been sentenced on all the predicate crimes, which are the state financials, which was in Beaufort in November of 23. But in April, he was finally sentenced on the federal crimes. And that was sort of like, all right, if ever he gets an appeal, we have this federal sentence to fall back on. He's never going to get out of prison. And the reason I went was it was important to close the loop, but also because his lawyers and other lawyers are saying this may be the last time we see Alex Murdaugh in the light of day. Because at this point in the appellate process, it's not automatic that the defendant can show up, right? So, I went to see him and look him in the face and be in the room and potentially for the last time for a long time.
Amen. Valerie, thank you so much. The book is fantastic. Really appreciate you coming on and talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really am so happy that you invited me.
And that's it for this episode. Valerie, thank you so much. The Devil at His Elbow. This is the definitive account, people. Go out and get it. You're going to love it. Hit us up as always, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget about YouTube. Send us mail, email, whatever. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.
History Nerds United.